Hey guys, today I'm going to show you one of the upcoming features in Marmoset Skyshop 104. We've added terrain and vegetation shaders, and I'm going to walk you through getting terrain to use custom marmoset materials and getting your trees and vegetation to use image-based lighting. So let's first create a terrain object and import a height map from a raw file. So raw files are sort of like image files, except they contain no header data to define what the bit depth or the dimensions of the image are. So you have to know all these things beforehand. So I know that mine is a 16-bit image, 4096, and it was made on Windows. And finally set some arbitrary size parameters for how the height map gets interpreted and how the mesh gets generated. And we've got a terrain. Next, let's add some texture layers to the terrain. And so you do that in the Terrain Inspector under the Paint Texture tab. And you can just add textures. We've got 4 textures ready to go with normal maps included. And now I'm ready to paint with my texture layers. Now painting textures by hand can take a long time, and so we've included a tool for importing a splat map or a control texture, something that changes the weights of each layer based on RGB and A channels. So here's our splat map. It's very colorful. You have to make sure that it's in true color and not compressed, and it can be as big as you want. And then go into Terrain, Import Splat Map. These are 2 scripts that are now included with Skyshop. So Import Splat Map is a little utility, and you can drag in a terrain and then a texture to apply to the terrain as a splat map. There's some rules. The texture format can't be compressed and has to be ARGB32. The tool also can't create or remove texture layers, so that's why beforehand we had to set up our 4 texture layers. So if you only have 2 texture layers set up for your terrain, it will only import the R and G components of the texture. And then there are some options to flip the image vertically. Sometimes you'll need to do that. And you can also flip the layer order. So if you want the red component to be layer 4 instead of layer 1, you can do that. And import. So this can be very handy. These images were, I think, generated in World Machine, as well as the height map and some of the other normal map data that we have. And it can be much faster doing it in a terrain generator than trying to paint it by hand. Now you notice the splat map is fairly low resolution. That's not actually controlled by the texture itself here, but if you select a terrain, and yeah, we can apply those. If you select a terrain in the terrain settings, there's actually a control texture resolution field. So if you set this to 1024, it will recalculate it and it will discard your splat map. But that's okay, we can just re-import it. And then that texture gets resampled at twice the resolution. And so finally, we'll want to assign a custom material to this terrain because maybe one that takes image-based lighting into account. So we've created a terrain material here, and we can just add that to, again, in the terrain settings tab, there's a field for a custom material. Marmoset comes with 2 different types of terrain shaders. So there's a simple terrain shader, which is applied now, and this is the equivalent of Unity's own terrain shader, just no specular, just diffuse lighting and image-based lighting on top of that. And then there is the more advanced terrain shader model. There are 2 options there for diffuse only or diffuse and specular terrain. And so this exposes a lot of options for layer tiling, all of the specular intensity and sharpness options that you've seen in regular Marmoset shaders, and these can also be adjusted per layer, as well as diffuse Fresnel for things like grass and fuzzy looking surfaces with softer lighting equations on them. You can also define a base diffuse texture. So let's apply that here. This gets applied to the entire terrain. So the UV coordinates span the entire terrain, and it's like the base color for the diffuse color in our tiling textures. And there's similarly a base normal map, which will apply an overall normal map for the big stuff, the big terrain features. And then the tiling normal maps will get applied on top of that. There's also a slider for detail weight, so you can kind of see how the base normal map and the tiled normal maps overlay. So let's take a look at some of these specular controls. There's a master specular intensity that controls all of the layers at once, and then we can adjust each one individually. So for instance, the first two layers involve grass, so we don't want those to be specular at all. And then the two rock layers can be shinier. And there are also sharpness sliders. So if we really wanted to make wet rocks, you can crank the shininess and take the Fresnel up a little, which similarly to the main Marmoset shaders will push the Fresnel towards only the grazing angles. Very nice for water and wet effects. You can also add Fresnel into the diffuse of the layers. So what this does is it will add more diffuse light at grazing angles, which simulates kind of fuzzy grass and moss look especially good with this. So you'll want that in on your grass layers, or it also helps with sand and sandstone to kind of soften the lighting a little. The diffuse base map also has an ambient occlusion term in the alpha channel, so that is only going to occlude the image-based lighting component of illumination. So direct light won't be affected by it, but the image-based lighting will. You can also set up the splat maps and layers yourself here. Now, right now, these are all controlled by the terrain engine. We can drag a texture in here, but that'll be overwritten by the terrain engine. But if you were to import a terrain model yourself and assign this shader to the material on it, you could set all of this up manually. And similar to the other shaders, you can add custom diffuse and specular cube maps here as well. Other features you'll note, you can adjust the tiling per layer. So if we wanted to make the second grass tile a lot bigger, you can certainly do that. You can also add an offset to each tile, fractional offset, which helps kind of break up some of the tiling artifacts you might see. If all your layers tile in the exact same pattern, then you'll notice edges and repeat patterns. But you could offset them just slightly very easily. The layer textures, the tiling layer textures for the material contain diffuse color in the RGB components and a specular intensity mask in the alpha component. So for instance, when you look at the grass and rocks layer here, the diffuse channel has masked out all the rocks so that the grass is dull and matte while the rocks remain shiny. So when we go back to the material to change our intensity here, we'll notice that the rocks really pop out nicely. You may notice a square tiled edge where the nearby and distant terrain meet. This is actually Unity rendering the terrain with two different types of shaders, and it's controlled by this base map distance parameter in the settings. So the distant tiles of the terrain are rendered with a much cheaper shader. You can see that there's no specularity, no normal mapping, just diffuse color and no ambient occlusion even. And then the nearby ones are rendered with the expensive shader. And so to kind of ease this transition between the two sets of tiles, the terrain shader has a parameter to fade some of the features out. So for instance, if we set the fade distance to 100 here and change the fade range to be very low, we can see that there's a pretty sharp fall off where specularity and normal mapping goes away. And we can march that out to kind of the edge of where these square tiles begin and match that up with Unity's fade. And there's still going to be some popping as detail textures come in and out, but it looks much nicer as a general transition. You can also add trees and vegetation to the terrain. For instance, let's add some grass. Go over to the Paint Details tab and add a new grass texture. Just pick one of the ones that comes with Unity. And paint it on as you would any texture layer. Skyshop comes with a replacement shader for the grass, so any grass you add to your scene will automatically render with a different shader that takes image-based lighting into account. You can also add trees in a similar fashion. Edit trees and add. We can add one of the default palm trees that comes with Unity. Now the palm trees, on the other hand, do not get affected by the image-based lighting by default, and they don't support a replacement shader. So you'll have to edit the palm tree asset by hand. The best way to see whether or not a tree is being affected by image-based lighting is to go to the sky, and you can mess with the intensity or the exposure. As you can see, even if I take my exposure all the way down, everything is black, but the trees still glow in the dark. So let's take a look at the palm asset. It is one of the example assets that comes with Unity, and we can take this little prefab and drag it into our scene directly, and it'll be easier to work with. And now you can see that it's got two shaders on it. Unity actually has two types of trees. The palm tree is one of the older models, and it uses soft occlusion bark and soft occlusion leaves. And then the newer version would be the tree creator trees, which use their own shaders. So we want to use the Marmoset version of the soft occlusion bark and soft occlusion leaves. And now you can see that the tree is affected by camera exposure, as you would expect it to be. But the trees that are associated with the terrain, trees that we painted on, are still unlit. To do that, we need to force the terrain to update all these trees from the prefab that we just changed. That's easy enough. You just double click on the tree to edit it. You don't have to make any changes, but that forces the tree to reload the prefab asset. And now everything should be lit appropriately. The billboards sometimes take a second to update in the editor mode, but in play mode, they work just fine. We can do the same with tree creator trees. We've got another Unity default asset is this big tree. We can also add that to the terrain as we did with the palm. Big tree. Oops. It has a similar problem. You can see it's all black. It's not being lit by the IBL. So we can select the tree creator tree and select one of its branch nodes, and we can see it has these materials assigned to it. We can change these materials directly or drag new ones in here. We can take a look at these shaders and switch them out from tree creator bark to Marmoset nature tree creator bark and Marmoset nature tree creator leaves. Now you also notice that even our instance of the prefab here is not updating. And that is because the tree creator system here takes whatever materials are assigned here and creates optimized versions of those shaders and applies them. To force the tree creator tree to update, we need to select one of the trunk nodes and then select the base node. And you can see now Unity is working on creating those new materials, and now everything is updated. We can test that out with the camera exposure again. The leaves and everything is going. It's working just fine. And the same trick applies to the trees that have been painted with tree creator trees. We just double click and the changes get reloaded from the prefab. It seems cumbersome at first, but it's pretty easy to take a pass through all your tree and vegetation assets, and even after you've painted a terrain full of trees, you can just change these materials out and quickly get the terrain system to reload everything and apply image-based lighting. If you want to dig deeper into how the shaders work, take a look at the source files. They're all in the core Marmoset shader directory under terrain. And there are many passes to get a terrain shader working. There are 3 per shader. So the first pass is the core pass, which renders the 4 main texture layers. And that's going to be the pass that does all the specularity and the normal mapping and everything. Any layers beyond the first 4 will be rendered with a simpler additive pass. So it's going to render another draw pass and composite that on top of the first 4. And then finally, there's a simpler shader for distant terrain tiles. You can also check out the grass shader as well as all of the vegetation shaders. There are a lot of files here, but they're all modeled off of the basic built-in Unity shaders. We also had to implement vertex lighting for the vegetation shader, so we've exposed that to the basic material system as well. This does very simple per vertex diffuse lighting from direct light sources and does the diffuse and specular cube map lookups as well. They're very fast and very lightweight. Encourage you to check them out, especially if you're working on mobile projects. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this walkthrough of Marmoset Skyshop's new terrain tools and shaders. We hope that you download it from the asset store and try it out for yourself. As always, if you have questions, don't hesitate to post on the Skyshop thread on the Unity forums or drop us a line at support@marmoset.co.